There's nothing quite like the ache of watching life pass you by, while everyone else seems to find their place in the world. At 40 years old, Hakon the Silent knows this feeling better than most. A Viking who has never held a woman or earned a warrior's respect. While other men in his Norwegian village boast of their conquests and battle scars, Hakon tends his lonely cabin in the fjords. The villagers call him the gentle giant behind his back, and he's learned to accept that some men are simply meant to walk through life alone. But one stormy night changes everything when a desperate woman named Astrid appears at his door. Cast out by her own family and carrying her own burden of loneliness, she sees something in Hakon that no one else ever has. As they shelter together from the storm, two broken souls discover they might not be as alone as they thought. But will their connection survive when raiders threaten the village and Hakon must choose between safety and fighting for love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm had been building for 3 days, and Hakon the Silent could feel it in his bones, the way his grandfather used to predict the weather. At 40 winters, he had learned to read the signs that others missed, the way the wind shifted through the pine branches, how the gulls flew inland seeking shelter, the particular grey that settled over the fjord like a wool blanket. These were the small wisdoms a man gathered when he spent most of his life alone. His cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, a day's walk from the village of Fjord, close enough to trade his woodwork for supplies, but far enough to avoid the daily reminders of what he was not. The structure itself bore the marks of his craftsmanship. Every beam fitted with precision, every joint sealed against the harsh Norwegian winters. The walls were thick oak, chinked with moss and clay, and the roof was layered with birch bark and sod that would sprout wildflowers come spring. It was a home built by a man who understood that comfort came not from grandeur, but from quiet competence. Inside, the space reflected its owner's careful nature. Hand-carved shelves lined one wall, holding his few precious books, gifts from the village priest who had taught him to read despite the other boys' mockery. A stone hearth dominated the far end, its chimney drawing perfectly after years of small adjustments. The furniture was simple but beautifully made. A sturdy table, 2 chairs he had carved from a single fallen oak, a bed frame that had never creaked under restless sleep, because restless sleep required someone to share it. Hakon moved through his evening routine with the measured pace of a man who had no one waiting for his return. He checked the animals in the small barn he had built. Against the cabin's north wall, 2 goats, a milk cow, and a handful of chickens that provided eggs and the occasional stew. The livestock were well tended, their shelter as carefully constructed as his own home. He spoke to them in the gentle voice that had earned him his nickname, words of comfort that no human had ever heard directed their way. The weathered axe hung on its peg by the door, untouched except for the monthly ritual of oiling the handle and checking the blade's edge. It had been his father's, and his fathers before that, passed down through generations of men who had earned their place in the world through strength and courage. Hakon kept it sharp, more from habit than hope. At his age, if he hadn't found his warrior's heart by now, he never would. The rain began as he secured the last of the shutters, fat drops that spoke of the deluge to come. He had prepared for this. His larder was stocked with dried fish, preserved meat, and root vegetables that would last through any siege of weather. Living alone had taught him the virtue of preparation, the peace that came from knowing he could weather any storm without depending on another soul. As the wind picked up, sending branches scratching against his roof like skeletal fingers, Hakon settled by the fire with a piece of birch he had been carving. His hands, large and calloused from a lifetime of honest work, moved with surprising delicacy as he shaped the wood into the form of a raven. It was one of a dozen such carvings that would eventually make their way to the village market, traded For the few things he could not make or grow himself, the solitude no longer stung as it once had. In his youth, he had raged against his isolation, had forced himself into situations where his awkwardness and gentle nature made him a target for ridicule. He remembered the summer he had tried to court Sigrid, the blacksmith's daughter, only to have her laugh openly when he had stammered through his offer to provide for her. He remembered the raiding party that had left him behind, claiming they needed someone to watch the village, while the real men sought glory across the sea. But time had worn down his anger. The way water smooths river stones, he had found a different kind of peace in accepting what he was and what he was not. The village still whispered about him, Hakon the Silent, the gentle giant who had never taken a life or a wife. But their words had lost their power to wound. He had built a life of quiet dignity, and if it was a lonely life, at least it was his own. The storm reached full fury just as he was considering sleep. The wind howled through the mountains like a living thing, and the rain drummed against his shutters with increasing violence. He added another log to the fire and checked that his oil lamp had sufficient fuel. Bad storms had a way of lasting longer than expected in these mountains, and he had learned never to trust that morning would bring clear skies. It was then that he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm's symphony, a rhythmic pounding against his door, desperate and human. Hakon froze, his carving knife halfway through a delicate curve in the raven's wing. Visitors were rare at any time. In weather like this, they were unthinkable. The pounding came again, more urgent now, and he heard something that made his heart clench, a woman's voice, barely audible over the wind, calling for help. He set aside his carving and moved to the door, hesitating only a moment before lifting the heavy bar that secured it. The wind nearly tore the door from his hands as he opened it, driving rain into his face with stinging force. There, swaying, in his doorway like a tree about to fall, stood a woman he had never seen before. She was soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her skull, and her dress, once fine by the look of the weave, was torn and mud-stained. But it was her eyes that stopped him, wide and desperate and carrying a depth of exhaustion that spoke of more than just physical hardship. "Please," she gasped, and the single word contained worlds of need. Hakon stepped aside without hesitation, his mother's teachings about hospitality stronger than any surprise or caution. The woman stumbled across his threshold and nearly fell, catching herself against the doorframe with hands that shook from cold or fatigue or both. He secured the door against the storm and turned to find her standing in the center of his carefully ordered space, dripping onto his clean floor and looking around with the wide-eyed confusion of someone who had found shelter but didn't quite believe in its reality. "Sit," he said, his voice rougher than he intended from lack of use. He gestured toward the chair closest to the fire. "You need warmth." She moved toward the hearth with unsteady steps, and Hakon found himself studying her with a craftsman's eye for detail. She was not young, perhaps 30 winters, old enough to have found her place in the world under normal circumstances. Her features were strong rather than delicate, and her frame carried the solid reality of a woman who had known both comfort and hardship. She was not what the skalds would call beautiful, but there was something in her bearing that suggested she had once been proud. As she settled into the chair, Hakon moved with quiet efficiency around his small domain. He pulled dry clothes from his chest, a spare tunic and leggings that would be too large for her, but would serve until her own things could be dried. He set water to heat in his iron pot and gathered wool blankets that still carried the scent of the cedar chest where he stored them. "I have dry clothes," he said, offering the bundle. "There's a screen in the corner where you can change. The fire will warm you." She looked up at him then, really looked, and Hakon felt something shift in the careful equilibrium of his world. Her eyes were brown, the deep brown of rich earth, and they held an intelligence that had been tested by experience. More than that, they held recognition. Not of who he was, for they were strangers, but of what he was. She saw the loneliness in him as clearly as he saw it in her, and neither of them flinched from the recognition. "Thank you," she said, and her voice carried the cadence of education, of someone who had been taught to speak well in better times. "I am Astrid Eriksdottir." The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it, with a mixture of pride and pain, told him that once it had meant something to others. "Hakon," he replied simply. "You are welcome in my home, for as long as the storm lasts." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read something written there. "You don't know who I am," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. Should I? A smile touched her lips, the first he had seen from her, and it transformed her features in a way that made something flutter in his chest. "No," she said. "I suppose there's no reason you should." "That's rather a relief, actually." She rose and moved behind the carved wooden screen he had fashioned years ago, more from a sense of what a proper home should contain than from any expectation of needing it. He heard the whisper of wet cloth being removed and forced himself to focus on practical matters, banking the fire to provide steady heat, preparing a simple meal from his stores, setting out his few pieces of crockery. When she emerged, transformed by dry clothes and the beginnings of warmth, Hakon found himself struggling to maintain his usual composure. The oversized tunic and leggings should have made her look diminished, but instead they emphasized her essential solidity, the sense that she was a woman who could endure whatever the world chose to throw at her. Her hair, freed from its wet tangles and drying in the firelight, revealed threads of red gold that caught the flame's glow. "I must look a sight," she said, settling back into the chair with a sigh that seemed to come from her very soul. "You look warm," Hakon replied, and meant it as the highest compliment he could offer. "That's what matters." They sat in companionable silence while the storm raged outside, and Hakon marveled at how natural it felt to share his space with another person. He had grown so accustomed to solitude that he had forgotten how a room could feel larger and smaller at the same time when it contained two souls instead of one. "How long have you lived here?" Astrid asked, accepting the bowl of stew he offered with hands that had steadied now that warmth was returning to them. 15 years, he said. "Since my mother passed. Alone all that time?" The question held. No judgment, only curiosity, and Hakon found himself answering more honestly than he might have otherwise. "Alone by choice, mostly. The village and I don't quite understand each other." She nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I know something about that," she said, "about not fitting where others think you should." The fire crackled between them, punctuating the comfortable quiet that followed. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and Hakon realized with something that might have been gratitude that this unexpected guest would likely need to stay until morning. It had been so long since he had shared a meal, shared conversation, shared the simple pleasure of another person's presence in his carefully constructed solitude. "What brought you out in this weather?" he asked eventually, though he suspected the answer would carry pain. Astrid set down her empty bowl and stared into the fire for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of recent wounds. "I was traveling, seeking a new place to call home. The storm caught me on the mountain path, and I saw your light." It wasn't the whole truth. Hakon could hear the careful editing in her words, but it was truth enough for now. Everyone carried secrets, and a man who had spent 40 years learning to live with his own understood the need for gradual revelation. "Well then," he said, rising to add another log to the fire, "it seems the storm brought you where you needed to be." She looked up at him with those earth-brown eyes, and again he felt that flutter in his chest, that sense of the world shifting on its foundations. "Yes," she said softly, "I believe it did." As the night deepened and the storm continued its assault on the mountains, Hakon found himself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, his days of walking through life alone might be coming to an end. The storm passed before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming under the early sun. Hakon woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves and the unfamiliar whisper of another person breathing in his home. For a moment he lay, still on his simple bed, listening to Astrid's steady breathing from where she slept wrapped in blankets beside the dying fire. The reality of her presence felt both strange and completely natural, as if some part of him had been waiting 40 years for this exact morning. He rose quietly, not wanting to wake her, and stepped outside to assess what damage the storm might have done. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of rain-washed pine and the distant salt of the fjord. His small homestead had weathered the tempest well, a few broken branches to clear, but nothing that spoke of serious damage. As he worked, he found himself glancing frequently toward the cabin, still hardly believing that someone else shared his sanctuary. It was while he was hauling a fallen pine branch away from his goat pen that he saw it, a dark shape on the narrow beach where the mountain stream met the fjord's edge. At first, he thought it might be driftwood cast up by the storm, but something about its shape and the way the morning light caught it made him abandon his work and climb down the steep path for a closer look. The bloodied Viking helmet lay half-buried. In the gravel and kelp, its iron surface dented and stained with what could only be blood. Hakon's hands trembled slightly as he lifted it, recognizing the distinctive wolf design etched into the nose guard, a mark he had seen worn by the scouts from Fjord village, the leather straps that should have secured it to a warrior's. Head were cut clean through, and dried blood darkened the interior. His stomach clenched as he turned the helmet over in his hands. Olaf Grimson had worn one just like this, the young scout who carried messages between the scattered settlements along the fjord. A good man, barely 25 winters, with a wife and infant son waiting for his return. The implications of finding his helmet here, bloodied and abandoned, sent ice through Hakon's veins, despite the warming sun. "What have you found?" Astrid's voice made him turn. She had dressed in her own clothes, now dry but still bearing the stains and tears of her desperate flight through the storm. She picked her way carefully down the rocky path, her eyes fixed on the object in his hands. "Trouble," Hakon said, holding up the helmet so she could see the wolf design. "This belongs to one of our village scouts, or belonged to him." Astrid's face paled as she took in the blood and damage. She had seen enough of the world to understand what such evidence meant. Raiders. Has to be. The question is, how many, and how close? Hakon scanned the fjord's surface, looking for any sign of dragon-prowed ships that might still be lurking in the maze of islands and inlets that dotted the coast. The water appeared empty, but that meant nothing. Viking longships could hide in water so shallow other vessels would run aground. "We have to warn the village," Astrid said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Hakon nodded grimly. "The question is whether there's still time." He looked again at the helmet, noting details that painted an increasingly dark picture. The blood was dry but not ancient, perhaps a day old, maybe two. The cuts in the leather were clean, made by sharp blades wielded with skill. This had not been the work of desperate bandits, but of organized warriors who knew their trade. They climbed back to the cabin in thoughtful silence. While Astrid gathered her few possessions, Hakon prepared for the journey to Fjord. He strapped on the leather vest he wore when trading, more for its pockets than any protection it might offer, and considered taking his father's axe. The weapon had hung unused for so long that the idea of actually carrying it into potential danger felt foreign, almost presumptuous. What use would he be in a fight? He had never drawn blood, never felt the bite of steel on steel that marked a true warrior, but the helmet in his hands argued for caution over pride. He lifted the axe from its peg, surprised by how natural its weight felt in his grasp, despite years of neglect. The handle was smooth and perfectly balanced, worn by generations of calloused palms. For the first time in his life, Hakon strapped his ancestral weapon to his belt with the genuine possibility he might need to use it. The path to Eric's fjord wound through pine forests and across meadows still sparkling with dew from the previous night's storm. Under normal circumstances, it was a pleasant walk that Hakon made monthly to trade his woodwork for supplies. Today, every shadow could hide an enemy, every sound might herald an attack. He found himself studying the landscape with new eyes, noting places where ambushes might be laid, paths that could be blocked, defensible positions that could shelter non-combatants. "You think like a warrior," Astrid observed, watching him scan a ridgeline that commanded the approach to the village. Hakon shook his head. "I think like a woodsman. Same skills, different purpose. I know these mountains, every path and hiding place. That's not the same as knowing how to fight. Sometimes knowing the ground is more valuable than knowing the sword," she replied, and something in her tone suggested she spoke from experience rather than theory. They crested the final hill as the sun reached its zenith, and Eric's fjord spread below them like a scene from the old stories. The village hugged the shoreline where a river emptied into the fjord. Its wooden buildings clustered around the central hall like chicks around a mother hen. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Hakon could see people moving about their daily tasks, unaware that death might be sailing toward them across the grey water. Jarl Magnus held court in the great hall, as was his custom during the middle hours of the day. The building was the largest structure in the village, its timber walls carved with scenes of ancient battles, and its roof supported by pillars that had once been the masts of conquered ships. When Hakon and Astrid entered, bearing the bloodied helmet between them, the casual conversations died into focused silence. Magnus was a man approaching his 60th winter, grey-bearded and thick around the middle, but still carrying himself with the authority that had kept Eriksfjord prosperous and relatively peaceful for 2 decades. His eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, fixed immediately on the helmet in Hakon's hands. "Where did you find this?" he asked without preamble. "Washed up on the beach below my cabin," Hakon replied, placing the helmet on the scarred wooden table that dominated the hall's center. "The blood is recent, a day, perhaps 2. Magnus examined the helmet with the practiced eye of a man who had seen his share of battles. The other men present, warriors, craftsmen, and elders who formed the village's informal council, pressed closer to see the evidence of approaching danger. "Olaf's helmet," confirmed Eric the blacksmith, a man whose massive frame dwarfed even Hakon's considerable bulk. "I helped fit the straps myself not a month past. Then Olaf is dead," Magnus said grimly, "and we must assume his knowledge died with him. The question is, what enemies have learned of our defenses and when they plan to use that knowledge." "There's more." Astrid spoke for the first time since entering the hall, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly attentive space. "I've traveled these coasts recently. There are strange ships moving in the outer islands, flying no banners, but carrying too many men to be honest traders." The attention shifted to her, and Hakon saw several men exchange glances that spoke of recognition and suspicion. Whoever Astrid was, her name was not unknown in these parts, though the reactions suggested her reputation was complicated. "And who might you be to speak of such things?" asked Thorvald the Grey, the village's eldest warrior and Magnus's most trusted advisor. "I am Astrid Eriksdottir," she replied with quiet dignity, "and I speak of what I have seen with my own eyes." The name sent murmurs through the assembled men, and Hakon caught fragments of whispered conversations that painted a picture of scandal and exile. He remembered her words from the previous night about not fitting where others thought she should, and began to understand the weight of whatever history had driven her to his door. Magnus raised a hand for silence. "Whatever disagreements we may have had with your family, Astrid, your warning is noted, but the question remains, what do we do with this knowledge?" "We prepare for siege," Thorvald declared, his scarred hand resting on his sword hilt. "Pull in the outlying families, Organize the defenses, send messages to our neighbors calling for aid. And if we're wrong? Asked another voice. If we abandon the fishing season and the harvest preparations for shadows and fear. The debate that followed revealed the essential problem facing Eriksfjord. They were prosperous because they were peaceful, but their prosperity made them a target for those who preferred taking wealth to earning it. The village's warriors were capable but few, better suited to defending against raiders than mountain bandits, than organized assault by professional killers. As the arguments swirled around him, Hakon found himself studying the great hall with the same analytical eye he had applied to the mountain paths. The building was impressive, but not defensible. Its walls were wood, its windows large enough for arrows, its doors wide enough for armed men to charge through shoulder to shoulder. The village had grown up around trade and farming, not warfare, and it showed in every aspect of its construction. "What do you think, Hakon?" Magnus asked suddenly, and the hall fell silent as every eye turned toward the man they had long dismissed as irrelevant to questions of war and defense. Hakon felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, the familiar sensation of being judged and found wanting. But the bloodied helmet on the table before him spoke of consequences more serious than wounded pride. If enemies were coming for Eriksfjord, they would not spare the gentle giant who lived alone in the mountains. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should assume the worst and hope for the best. Better to prepare for battle and face only rumors than to dismiss warnings and face steel unprepared." It was not the answer of a warrior. No boasts of courage, no promises of victory, no stirring calls to martial glory. But it was the answer of a man who understood that survival often depended more on careful preparation than heroic gestures. Magnus nodded slowly. "Wisdom often sounds less impressive than bravery," he said, "but it serves better in the long run." He turned to address the hall at large. "We prepare. Send riders to the outlying farms, organize watches on the approaches, inventory our weapons and supplies. If death comes calling, we'll be ready to answer." As the hall erupted into organized activity, Hakon felt Astrid's hand touch his arm gently. When he looked down at her, he saw something in her eyes that he had never seen directed toward him before: respect, and perhaps something deeper. "You did well," she said softly. "They listened to you. They listened to common sense," he replied. But he could not quite suppress the flutter of pride her words kindled in his chest. Outside the hall, the peaceful village of mourning was transforming into something harder and more focused. Men checked weapons that had hung unused on walls. Women gathered children closer to their sides, and everyone moved with the particular urgency that comes when abstract danger becomes concrete threat. As Hakon watched his neighbors prepare for war, he realized that his 40 years of peaceful isolation were ending whether he chose it or not. The bloodied helmet had changed everything, washing away the quiet certainty of his solitary life like a tide that could not be turned back. Beside him, Astrid watched the preparations with eyes that held both sadness and determination. Whatever had driven her into the storm and to his door, she was now bound to share whatever fate awaited Eriksfjord. And somehow, despite the danger that stalked across the water toward them, Hakon found himself grateful that when the ending came, he would not face it alone. The days that followed the discovery of Olaf's helmet passed with the strange rhythm of a community preparing for war while hoping it would not come. Eriksfjord buzzed with activity as families from the outlying farms arrived with their livestock and possessions. The village swelling beyond its normal boundaries like a pot threatening to boil over. Children who normally ran free through the meadows now played within sight of their mothers, and conversations that once centered on weather and crops turned to weapons and defensive positions. Hakon found himself caught between two worlds. No longer the forgotten hermit living in isolation, yet not quite accepted as one of the village's true defenders. The men acknowledged his presence with respectful nods when he offered suggestions about securing the approaches or storing supplies. But when the talk turned to battle tactics and fighting formations, a subtle silence would fall that reminded him of his place in their estimation. It was this awkward position that drove him to seek solitude in the early morning hours, when most of the village still slept and he could practice with his father's axe without audience or commentary. Behind Astrid's temporary shelter, a small storage building that had been cleared for her use, Hakon worked through the basic forms his father had taught him as a boy, movements that had grown rusty from disuse, but were not entirely forgotten. The axe felt strange in his hands at first, heavier than he remembered, yet somehow more natural than any tool he had ever wielded. His father had been a careful teacher, emphasizing control over fury, precision over power. "Any fool can swing an axe in anger," the old man had said. "A warrior learns to swing it with purpose. Your stance is too wide." Hakon froze mid-swing, the axe suddenly feeling like an awkward burden in his grip. He turned to find Astrid watching. From the doorway of her shelter, her brown eyes taking in his embarrassed fumbling with an expression that held no mockery. "I'm sorry," he began, but she raised a hand to stop his apology. "Don't apologize for trying to learn," she said, stepping fully outside and closing the door behind her. She wore a simple dress borrowed from one of the village women, but she moved with an assurance that seemed at odds with her status as a displaced refugee. "Your father taught you well, but you're fighting ghosts instead of enemies." Hakon lowered the axe, feeling the familiar flush of inadequacy that had plagued him since childhood. "I suppose 40 years is too long to wait before learning to be a warrior." "Age has nothing to do with it," Astrid replied, approaching with the careful steps of someone who understood that wounded pride could be as dangerous as a sharp blade. "But you're trying to remember lessons instead of learning truth." "May I?" She gestured toward the axe, and after a moment's hesitation, Hakon handed it to her. The weapon looked almost comically large in her grasp, but she held it with a familiarity that spoke of more than casual observation. With fluid movements that held an economy of motion he had never achieved, she demonstrated the forms he had been attempting. "See how the power comes from the whole body, not just the arms?" she asked, her voice taking on the patient tone of an experienced teacher. "And the feet, they anchor you to the earth while allowing you to flow like water. Strength without flexibility is just brutality." She handed the axe back to him, and this time when Hakon attempted the movements, something clicked into place. The weapon became less foreign in his hands, more like an extension of his will than a burden to be carried. "How do you know such things?" he asked as they worked through the morning ritual together, she observing and correcting, he gradually finding a rhythm that felt more natural than anything he had achieved in his fumbling practice. Astrid was quiet. For a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, where the sun was painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of memory that had been long buried. "My father was Jarl Erik of Ravensholm," she said simply. "Before he decided I was more burden than daughter, he ensured I received the same training as my brothers. He said the world was too dangerous for any of his children to face it defenseless, regardless of whether they wore skirts or mail." The revelation explained much. Her bearing, her knowledge, the way the village men had reacted to her name. Ravensholm was a settlement 3 days' sail to the north, wealthy and well-defended, known for producing warriors as skilled as they were ruthless. For the daughter of such a place to end up seeking shelter with strangers spoke of a fall from grace, more dramatic than Hakon had imagined. "What happened?" he asked gently, then immediately regretted the question. "Forgive me, that's not my concern." "It's no great secret," she replied, though her voice carried an edge of old pain. "I refused the marriage he arranged for me. Refused it publicly and definitively enough that the insult could not be overlooked. My father chose his political alliance over his daughter's happiness, and I chose exile over submission. From her dress, she withdrew a small wooden medallion, carved with intricate knotwork that seemed to shift and flow in the morning light. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master artisan, and the wood itself had been worn, smooth by countless touches. "My grandmother gave me this before she died," Astrid continued, turning the medallion over in her palm. "She told me that true strength often looks like weakness to those who only understand force, that the gentlest water can carve through the hardest stone given time and purpose." Hakon studied the medallion with the eye of someone who understood fine craftsmanship. The knotwork pattern seemed to tell a story, not in words but in the flow of line and curve that spoke of ancient wisdom passed down through generations. At its center was carved a simple image, a tree whose roots ran as deep as its branches reached high. "She sounds like a wise woman," he said. "She was, and she would have liked you, I think." Astrid smiled, the expression transforming her features with a warmth that made something flutter in Hakon's chest. She always said that the world needed more men who were strong enough to be gentle. They continued their practice as the village began to stir around them, other early risers emerging to tend animals or begin the day's preparations. A few curious glances were cast their way, but most people were too busy with their own concerns to pay much attention to the unlikely pair working through weapon forms behind the storage building. As the sun climbed higher and the morning's coolness gave way to the promise of another warm day, Hakon found himself thinking about the changes that had occurred in his carefully ordered life. A week ago, his greatest concern had been whether the pine boards he was seasoning would warp in the mountain humidity. Now he was learning to fight from a woman whose exile had brought her to his door, preparing to defend a village that had never quite accepted him, facing the possibility that his 40 years of peaceful existence might end in violence and blood. Yet somehow, practicing with Astrid beside him, feeling the gradual improvement in his technique and the growing confidence in his movements, Hakon realized he had never felt more alive. The gentle giant who had accepted his place on the margins of society was discovering that when something truly mattered, when protecting others became more important than protecting himself, he might be capable of more than anyone had imagined, including himself. "Enough for this morning," Astrid said, noting the way his movements were beginning to show the strain of unaccustomed effort. Muscle memory builds slowly. Push too hard too fast, and you'll only teach yourself bad habits. Hakon lowered the axe, surprised to find that his hands were shaking slightly from the sustained effort. But it was a good kind of exhaustion, the fatigue that came from purposeful work rather than aimless struggle. "Thank you," he said, meaning it more deeply than the simple words could convey. "Thank you for letting me help," she replied. "It's been too long since I had someone to teach. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it." As they walked back toward the village center, where the day's councils and preparations would soon begin, Hakon caught sight of their reflection in a puddle left by the previous night's brief rain. For just a moment, instead of the awkward hermit and the exiled woman, he saw two people who belonged together, who complemented each other's strengths and understood each other's weaknesses. It was a dangerous thought, he knew. Hope had always been his greatest vulnerability, the thing that made disappointment cut deepest. But watching Astrid walk beside him, her grandmother's medallion catching the morning light as it hung around her neck, Hakon allowed himself to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, his long years of solitude had been preparation for something better rather than punishment for something lacking. The bloodied helmet still sat in Jarl Magnus's hall, a grim reminder that their peaceful interlude could shatter at any moment. But for now, in the growing warmth of the morning sun, Hakon the Silent walked beside someone who saw strength where others had seen only gentleness, and found himself believing that when the test came, he might not fail as completely as everyone, including himself, expected. 3 days after their first training session, Hakon found himself leading Astrid along a narrow mountain path that wound through stands of ancient pine toward a place few villagers had ever seen. The morning mist clung to the lower slopes like the breath of sleeping giants, and their footsteps made soft sounds on the carpet of pine needles that had accumulated over countless seasons. "Where exactly are you taking me?" Astrid asked, stepping carefully over a fallen log that blocked the barely visible trail. She carried a woven basket for gathering the healing herbs she had volunteered to collect for the village's medicine stores, but Hakon could see her curiosity growing with each turn of the path. "Somewhere I discovered as a boy," he replied, holding back a low branch so she could pass beneath it. "Somewhere that might help us understand what's coming." The path climbed steadily, switchbacking up the mountainside through groves of birch whose leaves whispered secrets in the morning breeze. Hakon had walked this way countless times over the years, drawn by a solitude even deeper than what his cabin provided. It was here he had come as a young man to wrestle with his feelings of inadequacy. Here he had retreated after each failed attempt to find his place among the village warriors. After nearly an hour of climbing, they emerged into a circular clearing dominated by a ring of standing stones that predated any memory or legend the current inhabitants of the fjord possessed. The monoliths rose from the earth like the fingers of some buried giant, each one carved with symbols that time and weather had worn but not entirely erased. In the center of the circle, a single stone lay flat, its surface covered with runes that seemed to shift and change in the dappled sunlight filtering through the surrounding trees. Astrid stopped short at the edge of the clearing, her breath catching in a way that had nothing to do with their climb. Her hand moved instinctively to the wooden medallion at her throat, and her eyes widened as she took in the ancient monument. "By Thor's hammer," she whispered. "How long have these been here?" "Longer than memory," Hakon replied, moving into the circle with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours among the stones. "The village elders say they were old when their grandfathers' grandfathers were young. I've never seen anyone else here." Astrid approached the central stone, with the reverence due to something sacred, her fingers hovering over the carved runes without quite touching them. Her lips moved silently as she studied the ancient symbols, and Hakon could see recognition dawning in her expression. "You can read them," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Some of them," she admitted, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and awe. "My grandmother taught me the old writing before she died. She said the ancient wisdom was too precious to lose to the passage of time." She knelt beside the stone, tracing the air above the carved symbols with one finger as she worked. Through the archaic text, the runes were different from the simple markings used for everyday purposes, older, more complex, carrying meanings that seemed to layer upon themselves like the rings of an ancient tree. "Here," she said, pointing to a sequence of symbols near the stone's center. "This speaks of a time of testing, when the gentle must become fierce and the meek must find their strength. It says," she paused, double-checking her translation before continuing, "it says that in the darkest hour, when all seems lost, the unexpected will rise to become the shield that guards the innocent." Hakon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "A prophecy, more than that," Astrid replied, moving to examine other sections of the inscription. "This part talks about two souls finding each other in the storm, about love born from shared loneliness, becoming a force that changes the fate of many." She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with something between wonder and fear. "Hakon, I think this stone is telling our story." He joined her beside the ancient monument, studying the runes that had been carved by hands long since turned to dust. The symbols seemed to writhe in his vision, forming patterns that felt meaningful, even though he could not read them. Around them, the standing stones loomed like silent witnesses to countless seasons of change, their weathered faces holding secrets that predated the coming of his people to these northern lands. "There's more," Astrid said, her voice barely above. A whisper, She had moved to the far side of the central stone, where the runes formed a different pattern. It speaks of a great testing that will come from the sea, led by one who was once bound to one of the two souls. It says that only when the gentle learns to fight not for glory, but for love, will the darkness be turned back. The wind picked up suddenly, sending the leaves overhead into a rustling dance that sounded almost like voices, speaking in a language older than words. Hakon found himself thinking of the bloodied helmet, of the fear growing in Eriksfjord, of the way Astrid's presence had awakened something in him that he had never known existed. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked. Surprising himself with the question, Astrid stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees as she considered his words. "I believe that some things are meant to be," she said finally, "but I also believe we choose how we meet our destiny. The runes may speak of what will come, but they don't rob us of the power to decide who we'll be when it arrives." They spent the next hour gathering herbs among the standing stones, meadowsweet for fever, willow bark for pain, yarrow for wounds that might soon need tending. But Hakon found his attention repeatedly drawn back to the central stone and its cryptic prophecy. The idea that his life might have meaning beyond his own small existence was both thrilling and terrifying. As they prepared to leave, Astrid placed her hand flat against the central stone's surface, closing her eyes as if listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them again, her expression held a determination that made her seem suddenly older, more formidable. "Whatever's coming," she said, "we'll face it together. The runes speak of two souls, not one walking alone." The path back to the village seemed shorter somehow, as if the ancient stones had rearranged the very fabric of the mountain to speed their return. They walked in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts of prophecy and possibility. But as they descended through the pine groves toward the familiar sounds of village life, Hakon became aware of something that made his warrior training stir to alertness. Smoke was rising from Eriksfjord, not the gentle wisps of cooking fires, but thick, dark columns that spoke of buildings burning. They broke into a run, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with desperate haste. The basket of herbs scattered its contents as Astrid stumbled, but neither of them paused to gather the precious medicines. Whatever was happening in the village below, they were already too late to prevent it. As they neared the tree line that would give them a clear view of Eriksfjord, Hakon could hear sounds that confirmed his worst fears, shouts of alarm, the clash of weapons, the screams of people in mortal terror. The peaceful settlement, where he had traded his woodwork for supplies, where he had finally begun to find acceptance, was under attack. The prophecy, Astrid gasped as they reached the edge of the forest and could see the chaos below. Its beginning. Viking longships filled the harbor like hungry wolves, their dragon prows gleaming in the afternoon sun. Armed warriors moved through the village streets with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. And somewhere in that maze of burning buildings and desperate combat, the people of Eriksfjord were fighting for their lives against odds that looked impossibly steep. Hakon's hand tightened on his father's axe as he watched his neighbors' homes burn. The gentle giant who had spent 40 years avoiding conflict was about to discover whether the ancient stones had spoken truth or merely offered the cruel mockery of false hope. "Come on," he said, his voice carrying a steadiness that surprised them both. "It's time to find out what we're really made of." Together, they plunged down the mountainside toward a battle that would determine not just the fate of Eriksfjord, but whether two lonely souls could indeed become the shield that guards the innocent in their darkest hour. Perhaps it was time to discover just how unexpected they could be. But as Hakon looked down at his bloodied axe and then up at Astrid's determined face, he realized that conventional resistance might not be their only option. The prophecy carved in ancient stone had spoken of the unexpected rising to become shields in the darkest hour. From the direction of the hall came a new sound that froze both their hearts. the splintering crash of the great doors finally giving. Way before Bjorn's assault, the defenders' last stronghold had fallen, and with it, any hope that Fjord's people might survive this day through conventional resistance. "Hakon," Astrid said softly, and when he turned to look at her, he saw something new in her eyes, not just respect or gratitude, but recognition. She was seeing him as he truly was for the first time, not the gentle giant who had accepted his place on the margins, but the warrior he had always carried within himself. In less than a minute, it was over. 3 experienced warriors lay dead in the dirt, and Hakon stood over them, with his father's axe dripping red for the first time in its long history. His hands were shaking, not from fear, he realized, but from the strange exhilaration of discovering capabilities he had never known he possessed. The third raider, seeing his companions fall with shocking swiftness, hesitated for a crucial instant. In that pause, Astrid moved, not with a weapon, for she carried none, but with a handful of dirt and gravel that she flung into the man's eyes with perfect timing. Blinded and off balance, he presented an easy target for Hakon's finishing blow. His father's axe came up to block the descending blade, the impact sending vibrations through his arms, but not overwhelming his grip. He pivoted, using the raider's own momentum to throw him off balance, and brought the axe head around in a horizontal sweep that caught the second attacker across the ribs with a sound like a butcher's cleaver biting into meat. They came at him together, as Hakon had somehow known they would. Professional killers didn't believe in fair fights or single combat when easier solutions presented themselves. But as the first sword swept toward his head, something extraordinary happened. Time seemed to slow, and Hakon found himself moving, not with the desperate flailing of an untrained man, but with the fluid grace Astrid had been teaching him. "Oh, but it does, Rabbit," he said. "Blood is exactly how this ends. The only question is how much of yours we spill before you die." The raiders laughed, the ugly sound men make when they encounter something they perceive as weakness masquerading as strength. The scarred leader hefted his sword, testing its balance with the casual expertise of a craftsman, examining his tools. "Turn around and walk away," he said quietly. "This doesn't have to end in blood." Hakon stepped forward, placing himself between Astrid and the approaching raiders. His father's axe felt heavy in his hands, but also strangely right, as if it had been waiting 40 years for this moment of purpose. "Well, well," said the leader, a scarred man whose missing left ear spoke of previous battles survived. "What have we here? A woodsman and his woman, hiding like rabbits." As if summoned by their conversation, a group of 3 raiders appeared, around the edge of their shelter, having worked their way through the village's back streets while the main battle raged near the hall. They moved with the confident swagger of predators who had cornered easy prey, their weapons already bloodied from other encounters. "And you think he'll keep that bargain?" Hakon turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not anger exactly, but a cold determination that transformed his gentle features into something harder. "Men like Bjorn don't make bargains, Astrid. They take what they want and destroy what they can't possess." "What can we do?" she demanded, her voice thick with anguish. "This is my fault, all of it. I should surrender myself to him. Maybe then he'll spare the others." "We have to do something," Hakon said, rising from behind their shelter despite Astrid's attempt to pull him back down. The clash of weapons rang out like a deadly song, punctuated by the cries of wounded men and the crash of splintering wood. Hakon watched in horror as Eric the blacksmith went down under 3 raiders' blades, his massive frame finally failing him when the odds became impossible. Young Leif, barely 18 and fighting with his grandfather's spear, managed to take 2 enemies with him before a sword found the gap in his improvised armor. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. Bjorn raised his sword, a magnificent weapon that caught the sunlight like captured fire, and gave a command that sent his raiders surging toward the hall from 3 directions at once. The defenders, who had been conserving their strength behind, The building's walls suddenly found themselves facing an assault designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers. Then she chose death for you all. Your property? Magnus spat into the dirt. Women are not cattle to be owned, you fool. And even if they were, Astrid Eriksdottir chose her own path. Bjorn laughed, a sound devoid of humour. The kind who takes what he wants instead of begging for scraps at other men's tables. You harbour my property, old man. Give me what's mine, and perhaps I'll let some of your people live. I'm here, you dog, Magnus replied, stepping fully into view. Though I wonder what kind of warrior attacks farmers and fishermen while calling himself brave. Magnus, Bjorn's voice carried clearly. Across the village, amplified by the acoustics of the fjord's natural amphitheatre. Come out and face me like the warrior you claim to be. Before Hakon could respond to her self-recrimination, a new commotion erupted near the hall. Jarl Magnus had appeared in the doorway, his sword in one hand and his shield in the other. Even from a distance, Hakon could see that the old warrior was wounded. He moved with the careful stiffness of someone favoring injured ribs, and dark stains on his mail spoke of blood loss. Yes. Astrid's voice carried a weight of guilt that made Hakon's heart ache. All these people dying, their homes burning, it's because of me, because I wouldn't submit to a marriage I didn't want. He's here for you, Hakon said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This was no random raid seeking easy plunder. This was personal. A scorned suitor who had turned his rejection into an excuse for revenge. The attack on Eriksfjord was not about wealth or territory. It was about reclaiming what Bjorn considered his property and punishing those who had given her shelter. I know him. The words came out flat and bitter, carrying years of old pain. Bjorn the Ruthless, they call him now. The man my father chose to be my husband, the man I refused to marry. You know him? Bjorn Ironside, Astrid breathed, and Hakon heard something in her voice that made him turn to study her profile. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles showed white against her skin. It was then that Hakon noticed something that sent ice through his veins. A familiar figure directing the raiders' movements from near the harbour. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even at a distance. His hair was the colour of wheat bleached by summer sun, and he wore mail that caught the light like fish scales. Even from their hiding place, Hakon could see the easy authority with which he gestured, sending groups of warriors to specific positions with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. How? Astrid asked, not challenging his resolve, but seeking practical answers. There are 2 of us and dozens of them. We die before we took 10 steps. We have to help them, Hakon said, his hand tightening on his axe handle. Hakon could see the Jarl's banner still flying above the hall's entrance, but the building was surrounded by at least 20 raiders who seemed content to wait for their prey to emerge, rather than risk the casualties that would come from storming the fortified position. It was a sound, tactical decision that spoke of leadership more cunning than the berserker rage Vikings were famous for. There, Astrid whispered, pointing toward the great hall where a knot of Eriksfjord's defenders had made their stand. Magnus and his men are trapped. Hakon and Astrid took shelter behind an overturned fishing boat on the village's edge, both breathing heavily from their desperate descent. From their hiding place, they could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding before them. Several buildings were ablaze, sending thick columns of smoke into the clear sky. Bodies lay scattered in the dirt. Some villagers, some raiders, but far too many of the former for Hakon's heart to bear. The scene that greeted them as they reached the outskirts of Eriksfjord was worse than Hakon's darkest imaginings. The raiders had struck with the precision of experienced killers, their longships sliding into the harbour like serpents while the village was distracted by the midday meal. Now Viking warriors moved through the settlement's narrow streets with brutal efficiency, their weapons gleaming wet in the afternoon sun. The fall of the great hall's doors echoed across Eric's fjord like the death knell of hope itself. From their position behind the overturned boat, Hakon and Astrid watched in horror as Bjorn's raiders poured through the shattered entrance like water through a broken dam. The sounds that followed, steel on steel, cries of pain, the crash of overturning furniture, painted a vivid picture of the massacre taking place within. "We have to move," Hakon said, wiping his father's axe clean on a fallen raider's cloak. The weight of the weapon felt different now, no longer foreign but somehow essential, as if killing had awakened something in him that had long lain dormant. "They'll sweep the village systematically once the hall is secured." Astrid nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Where can we go? The whole settlement will be under their control within the hour." Before Hakon could answer, a new voice reached them, thin and desperate, calling from somewhere deeper in the village. It was a child's voice, high and frightened, crying for help in the particular way that spoke of immediate mortal danger. Both of them turned toward the sound, and Hakon felt something twist in his chest at the thought of innocent suffering for adult conflicts they had no part in creating. "This way," he said, leading Astrid through the maze of abandoned buildings, toward the source of the cries. They moved carefully, using the smoke from burning structures as cover, pausing at each corner to ensure their path remained clear of enemy patrols. The voice led them to the village's small temple, a modest building dedicated to Thor, where the people of Eriksfjord came to ask for protection during storms, and to give thanks for safe returns from dangerous voyages. The wooden structure was older than most of the village, its walls carved with protective runes that seemed to mock their ineffectiveness in the face of human brutality. Inside, they found the source of the cries, a girl of perhaps 10 winters. Her blonde braids matted with tears and dirt crouched over the still form of an elderly woman. Hakon recognized both of them, little Sigrid, daughter of the village's ropemaker, and Inga the Wise, the settlement's healer and keeper of old knowledge. "She won't wake up," Sigrid sobbed as they approached. "The bad men hurt her and she won't wake up." Astrid knelt beside the fallen woman, her hands moving with gentle competence as she checked for signs of life. Inga's breathing was shallow but steady, and though blood matted her grey hair where a sword pommel had struck her down, her pulse remained strong under Astrid's practiced fingers. "She'll live," Astrid pronounced, relief evident in her voice. "But she needs time to heal." "Time we may not have. Why did they hurt Grandmother Inga?" Sigrid asked, her young voice thick with the kind of confusion that comes when the world suddenly stops making sense. "She never hurt anyone. She only makes people better when they're sick." Hakon felt a familiar rage building in his chest. Not the hot fury that drove berserkers into battle, but something colder and more focused. He had seen enough senseless violence for one day, enough innocent blood spilled to satisfy any god's thirst for sacrifice. But he also understood that anger alone would not save this child or heal this woman or bring back the dead who already littered Eriksfjord's streets. It was then that he noticed something that made his blood run even colder, a banner being raised. Above the great hall, its fabric snapping in the fjord's constant breeze. The design was unmistakable, a black wolf's head on a field of blood red, the personal symbol of Bjorn Ironside. But it was not the banner itself that made Hakon's hands tighten on his axe handle. It was what accompanied it. A second banner rose. Beside the first, this one bearing the distinctive raven symbol of King Harald's royal household. The implications hit Hakon like a physical blow. This was not just a raiding party seeking easy plunder or even a spurned lover's revenge. This was an official expedition, sanctioned by the crown itself, which meant that no help would be coming from other settlements. Bjorn had the king's ear, and more importantly, his authorization to claim whatever spoils he could take. "Astrid," he said quietly, gesturing toward the banners. "Look." She followed his gaze, and he watched her face crumble as she recognized the royal symbol. "Harald's raven," she whispered. "My father, He must have convinced the king that I dishonored our family's alliance. This isn't just about Bjorn's wounded pride anymore. This is about royal displeasure. The weight of this revelation settled over them like a burial shroud. They were not facing a simple raiding party that might be bought off or reasoned with. They were opposing the will of the king himself, which made them outlaws by definition. Even if they somehow survived the immediate battle, they would spend the rest of their lives running from royal justice. "And then we make our stand here," Hakon said, surprising himself with the calm certainty in his voice. "If we're to be outlaws anyway, we might as well be outlaws who protected the innocent." Astrid stared at him for a long moment, studying his face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The gentle giant who had offered her shelter from the storm was transforming before her eyes into something harder and more dangerous, but the essential kindness that had drawn her to him remained unchanged. "The temple has only one entrance," she pointed out. "We'd be trapped." "Sometimes trapped is what you want to be," Hakon replied, moving to examine the building's defensive possibilities with new eyes. "This is Thor's house. Let's see if the Thunder God appreciates guests who refuse to respect his hospitality." The temple's interior was simple but sturdy, its walls thick enough to stop arrows and its single entrance narrow enough for one person to defend against many. The altar at the far end was carved from a single block of granite, immovable and solid enough to provide cover from projectiles. More importantly, the building's position at the edge of the village gave them a clear view of the approaches, while limiting the directions from which they could be attacked. As Astrid tended to Inga's injuries and tried to comfort little Sigrid, Hakon began preparing their impromptu fortress. He overturned the heavy wooden benches to create barriers and positioned the temple's few oil lamps where they would provide the best light when darkness fell. The work was methodical and calming, each preparation a small act of defiance against the chaos that had consumed their world. "Why are you helping us?" Sigrid asked suddenly, looking up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. "The other men all ran away when the bad men came." Hakon paused in his preparations, considering how to answer. A child's question about adult failures and moral choices. "Because running away wouldn't make me sleep any better," he said finally, "and because some things are worth fighting for, even when you can't win. My papa said you weren't a real warrior," Sigrid continued with the brutal honesty of childhood. "He said you were too gentle to fight anyone." "Your papa was right," Hakon replied, testing the balance of his axe as he spoke. "I am too gentle to fight for the wrong reasons, but that doesn't mean I won't fight for the right ones." Outside, the sounds of systematic looting had begun. Raiders moving from building to building, claiming whatever valuables they could find while putting everything else to the torch. Smoke was beginning to thicken in the air, and Hakon could hear orders being shouted in the harsh dialect of the northern fjords. Bjorn's men were organizing for the next phase of their operation, which would undoubtedly involve hunting down any villagers who had escaped the initial assault. "They're coming," Astrid said quietly, looking out through a gap between the temple's shuttered windows. "I can see torches moving through the streets. They're searching every building." Hakon nodded unsurprised. Thorough brutality was Bjorn's trademark, the quality that had earned him his fearsome reputation and the king's favor. The man who had once sought to claim Astrid as his bride would not leave potential witnesses or future threats alive to complicate. "His victory, let them come," Hakon said, taking his position by the temple's entrance. The doorway was narrow enough that only one or two attackers could approach at a time, and the threshold was raised high enough to provide a small defensive advantage. "Thor's house has been sanctuary for generations. Tonight we'll make it a fortress." As the torchlight grew brighter and the voices louder, Hakon found himself thinking of the ancient runes they had discovered that morning. Prophecies carved in stone by hands long since turned to dust. The unexpected would rise to become shields in the darkest hour, the stones had promised. The gentle would become fierce when love was threatened. standing in the doorway of Thor's temple with his father's axe in his hands and 3 people depending on his protection. Hakon the Silent wondered if perhaps the ancient stones had been speaking not of distant heroes, but of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when circumstances demanded it. Behind him, Astrid whispered words of comfort to a frightened child while tending an injured old woman. In front of him, the torches of his enemies grew steadily brighter as they approached through the smoke-filled streets of a dying village. And in his hands, the axe that had never tasted blood until today felt ready to drink deep. The first raiders to find the temple came with the arrogant confidence of men who had faced no real resistance all day. They moved through the smoke-filled streets with torches held high, calling to each other in the crude dialect of professional killers as they systematically searched each building for survivors to slaughter or valuables to claim. Hakon watched them approach through a gap in the temple's shutters, counting their numbers and noting their weapons with the careful eye of a man whose life now depended on such details. 5 men in the lead group, all armed with sword and shield, all moving with the easy coordination that spoke of many battles fought together. Behind them, he could see more torches, at least another dozen raiders working their way methodically through the village's remaining structures. "Stay back from the windows," he whispered to Astrid, who was crouched beside the altar with Sigrid pressed close against her side. The old healer Inga had regained consciousness but remained weak, her eyes tracking the movement outside with the grim awareness of someone who understood exactly what their discovery would mean. The temple door was solid oak, reinforced with iron. Bands built to withstand storms rather than siege, but stout enough to give attackers pause. Hakon had barricaded it further with overturned benches, creating a barrier that would force any assault to come through a narrow opening where numbers would count for less than skill and determination. The lead raider, a bearded giant who stood, even taller than Hakon, reached the temple steps just as the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. His torch illuminated features that had been scarred by countless battles, and his grin revealed teeth filed to points in the manner of berserkers who sought to terrify their enemies even in death. "Come out, rabbits," he called, his voice echoing off the temple walls. "We know you're in there. Come out and die quickly, or we'll smoke you out and make your deaths last days instead of moments." Hakon said nothing, but his grip tightened on his father's axe. The weapon felt perfectly balanced in his hands now, no longer foreign, but as natural as any tool he had ever wielded. The blood that had dried on its blade served as a grim reminder that he was no longer the gentle giant who had never drawn blood in anger. When no response came from within, the raiders began testing the door with the hilts of their swords, gauging its strength and looking for weaknesses. The sound of metal on wood rang like hammer blows in the temple's confined space, making little Sigrid whimper and press closer to Astrid's protective embrace. It was then that everything changed. "Stand aside, you fools," came a new voice from outside, cultured, educated, carrying the unmistakable authority of noble birth. "Let me speak to them." The raiders stepped back with obvious deference, and a new figure appeared in the torchlight. Hakon's breath caught as he recognized the tall, broad-shouldered form of Bjorn Ironside himself, but it was Astrid's sharp intake of breath behind him that confirmed what his eyes were telling him. "Astrid," Bjorn called, his voice pitched to carry through the temple's thick walls. "I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. Come out and face what you've done." "Go away, Bjorn," Astrid replied, her voice carrying despite the slight tremor Hakon could hear in it. "You've had your revenge. The village burns. Innocent people are dead. What more do you want?" "What I've always wanted," Bjorn answered, and now his tone carried an intimacy that made Hakon's jaw clench with unexpected jealousy. "You, my bride, the woman who was promised to me and stolen away by her own stubborn pride. I was never yours to claim," Astrid shot back, rising from her position beside the altar to stand near one of the shuttered windows. My father had no right to promise what wasn't his to give. Bjorn's laughter was warm, almost fond, completely at odds with the destruction he had brought to Eriksfjord. Still so fierce, my beautiful Astrid, still so convinced that the world should bend to your will instead of accepting the order the gods have decreed. It was then that Astrid did something that shocked everyone present. She unbarred the temple door and stepped outside, moving with the regal bearing that spoke of her noble birth, despite her simple borrowed dress. Hakon started forward to stop her, but she held up one hand in a gesture that commanded obedience. "I'm here, Bjorn," she said, stepping fully into the torchlight where her former betrothed could see her clearly. "Face to face, as you demanded. Now tell me why you've slaughtered innocent people for the crime of offering me shelter." Bjorn's reaction was not what Hakon expected. Instead of triumph or vindictive satisfaction, the raider chief's face showed something that looked almost like relief, as if a wound that had been festering for months was finally beginning to heal. "Because I love you," he said simply, his words carrying across the temple grounds with startling sincerity. "Because losing you nearly drove me mad, and I thought if I could prove my strength, if I could show you what I was capable of achieving, you might finally understand that we belong together." "This is your idea of courtship?" Astrid gestured toward the burning village, her voice thick with disgust. "Murder and pillage and the screams of dying children? This is what the world looks like when you're not in it," Bjorn replied. And Hakon was disturbed to hear genuine pain in the man's voice. "Do you know what these months have been like for me? Do you know what it feels like to be rejected by the one person who could make your life complete?" From his position inside the temple, Hakon could see both of them clearly through the open door, Astrid standing straight and defiant, Bjorn reaching toward her with one hand, as if he wanted to touch her, but didn't quite dare. The scene had an intimacy that made Hakon feel like an intruder, despite the mortal danger it represented. "I have something for you," Bjorn continued, reaching into his belt pouch with careful, deliberate movements. "Something I should have given you long ago." What he withdrew made Astrid gasp and take an involuntary step backward. It was a knife, not just any blade, but one that Hakon could see was extraordinary even at a distance. The weapon's edge caught. The torchlight captured fire, and its handle was carved from what looked like whalebone, inlaid with silver wire, in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the flickering illumination. "My father's blade," Astrid whispered, recognition and shock warring in her voice. "How did you—" "He said it was lost when he cast you out for refusing me," Bjorn finished. "Yes, he gave it to me as part of our agreement, a consolation. Prize for the bride who slipped away in the night rather than face her duty." The knife was magnificent, clearly the work of a master smith and worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. But it was the way Astrid stared at it, the mixture of longing and pain in her expression, that told Hakon this weapon meant more than mere monetary value. This was her birthright, her connection to a heritage that had been stripped away when she chose exile over submission. "It belongs to you," Bjorn said, holding the blade out to her with both hands in the manner of someone offering a sacred gift. "It always has, just as you belong with me." "And if I take it?" Astrid asked, though Hakon could see her hands trembling with the desire to claim what was rightfully hers. "Then you come home with me," Bjorn replied, "as my wife, as my equal partner. In everything I do, these people—" he gestured toward the burning village— "they live or die based on your decision. Choose me, and I'll spare whoever still draws breath. Refuse me again, and I'll finish what I started here." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of flames consuming Eriksfjord's buildings and the distant sound of raiders looting whatever valuables they could find. Hakon found himself holding his breath, watching Astrid's face as she weighed the impossible choice Bjorn had laid before her. "You would spare them?" she asked. "All of them? Even the old woman and the child? Even the woodsman hiding in Thor's temple with his bloodied axe?" Bjorn replied, and Hakon realized with a shock that the raider chief had known of his presence all along. Though I admit I'm curious about him. Word is he killed 3 of my men single-handed. Rather impressive for someone the villagers call the gentle giant. Astrid turned to look back at the temple door, her eyes meeting Hakon's through the narrow opening. In that gaze he saw apology and determination in equal measure, saw her making the same calculation he would have made in her place, weighing one life against many, personal happiness against collective survival. I need to see the knife first, she said, turning back to Bjorn. I need to hold it to know it's real. Bjorn smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Hakon had seen from him, and extended the blade handle first toward the woman he had traveled so far to reclaim. As Astrid reached for her birthright, her fingers closing around the familiar grip of her father's knife, Hakon realized that everything they had experienced together, the storm, the shelter, the growing affection, the discovery of the ancient stones, had been leading to this moment. The question was what she would choose to do with it. The moment Astrid's fingers closed around the knife's whalebone handle, everything changed. The weapon seemed to come alive in her grip, its perfect balance and familiar weight-awakening muscle memories that had lain dormant since her exile. Hakon watched from the temple doorway as her entire bearing shifted, shoulders straightening, stance widening into the ready position of a trained warrior, eyes taking on the cold calculation of someone who understood exactly how deadly the blade in her hands could be. There she is, Bjorn said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and relief. There's the woman I fell in love with, not the beaten-down exile hiding in borrowed clothes, but Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of Jarls, trained in the warrior's arts from childhood. You remember those training sessions, don't you? She replied, and Hakon caught the subtle shift in her tone, less desperate now, more controlled. You remember how they usually ended? Bjorn's smile widened, showing teeth that were white and strong despite the filed points that marked him as a berserker. With you on your back in the dirt, cursing my name while I helped you up. Though I'll admit you gave me more trouble than most of your brothers. I was 14 then, Astrid said, testing the knife's edge with her thumb and finding it razor-sharp despite the months since it had been properly maintained. I've learned a few things since. The exchange had an intimacy that made Hakon's chest tighten with emotions he didn't want to examine too closely. These two shared a history that went far beyond the simple narrative of rejected suitor and defiant bride. They had grown up together, trained together, known each other in ways that transcended the political alliance their families had tried to create. Have you now? Bjorn asked, genuine curiosity coloring his tone. And who taught you these new things? Surely not the hermit cowering in Thor's house? The hermit has a name, Astrid replied, her voice carrying a warning edge. And he's saved. More lives today than you've taken, which makes him worth 10 of your raiders. Ah, Bjorn nodded, as if a puzzle piece had just fallen into place. So that's how it is. The gentle giant has captured the heart that I could never quite claim. His expression darkened, jealousy replacing the fond amusement that had marked his earlier words. Tell me, does he know what you are, what you were trained to do? He knows enough, Astrid said, but Hakon caught the slight hesitation in her voice and wondered what secret she still carried. It was then that Bjorn made a gesture that caused his raiders to step back, forming a wide circle around the temple with their torches held high. The move had the ritual quality of something practiced, and Hakon realized with growing dread what was being prepared. Trial by combat, Bjorn announced, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ancient law. You claim this woodsman is worth defending, that his life has value beyond the amusement his death might provide. Prove it. Send him out to face me, blade to blade, and let the gods decide whether fjords survivors live or die. Astrid's face went pale at the challenge, understanding as Hakon did that this was not mere brutal sport, but a legal proceeding, recognized throughout the northern kingdoms. Trial by combat was ancient law, older than kings and jarls, invoking the gods themselves as final arbiters of justice. To refuse would mark them as cowards and lawbreakers, but to accept meant sending an untested fighter against one of the most feared warriors in all of Norway. "That's not how this works, Bjorn," Astrid said, though her protest lacked conviction. "You can't force trial by combat on someone who hasn't agreed to the terms." "Can't I?" Bjorn gestured toward his men, who responded by raising their weapons, in a synchronized display that spoke of perfect discipline. "I am here under the king's banner, enforcing royal will. This settlement harbored a fugitive from justice, you, and must answer for that crime. Combat trial is ancient right and royal prerogative." From inside the temple, Hakon could see the trap closing around them with inexorable logic. Bjorn had maneuvered them into a position where refusal meant immediate death for everyone in the temple, while acceptance offered at least the slim chance of survival if the gods favored the righteous. It was a masterful manipulation of law, and custom by someone who understood both intimately. "I'll fight him," Hakon said, stepping through the temple doorway to stand beside Astrid in the flickering torchlight. His father's axe felt heavier than usual in his grip, but his voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "No," Astrid said immediately, turning to face him with desperate intensity. "You don't understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't some village brawl or tavern fight. This is Bjorn Ironside. He's killed dozens of men in single combat. He's never lost a trial by battle." "Then I suppose it's time his luck changed," Hakon replied, surprised by his own calm. The terror was there, lurking beneath the surface like ice under spring snow, but it was overlaid by something stronger, a quiet determination that felt as natural as breathing. Bjorn studied him with new interest, taking in Hakon's size and bearing with the professional assessment of a career killer. "The gentle giant speaks boldly for someone who's never faced a trained warrior. Tell me, woodsman, have you ever killed a man before today?" "3," Hakon replied honestly. "Your men, they were hurting innocent people." "And how did that feel?" Bjorn asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "That first taste of blood on your blade, that moment when you realized you had the capacity for violence after all?" Hakon considered the question with the same careful thought he brought to any problem requiring solution. "Like something I should have learned long ago," he said finally. "Like something I was always meant to do when the need arose." Something flickered in Bjorn's eyes. Not quite respect, but a recognition that the man facing him might be more than the simple hermit he appeared to be. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." It was then that Astrid did something that shocked everyone present. Moving with fluid grace that spoke of years of training, she reversed her grip on the knife and extended it handle first. "Toward Hakon, if you're going to fight him," she said, "you'll need more than just an axe. Take this. It was meant for battle, not decoration." Hakon stared at the offered blade, understanding the magnitude of what she was giving him. This was her birthright, her connection to a heritage that had been stripped away when she chose love over duty. To offer it to him was a declaration more powerful than words, a statement of trust and commitment that bound them together in ways deeper than marriage vows. "Astrid," he began, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "My grandmother used to say that weapons choose their wielders as much as wielders choose their weapons," she said. "This blade has been waiting its whole existence for the right hand to claim it. I hope, that hand might be yours." When Hakon's fingers closed around the knife's handle, he felt something like electricity run through his arm. The weapon was perfectly balanced, its weight distributed in a way that made it feel like a natural extension of his hand. More than that, it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if the blade remembered every battle it had fought and was eager to add new victories to its history. "Now that," Bjorn said appreciatively, "changes things considerably. Do you know what blade you hold, woodsman?" Hakon looked down at the knife in his hand, noting details he had missed in the torchlight. The steel showed the distinctive watering pattern of metal that had been folded hundreds of times in the forging, creating layers of different hardness that gave the edge both sharpness and resilience. The whalebone handle was carved with runes that seemed to shift in the flickering light, and the silver wire inlay formed patterns that hurt to look at directly. "It's dwarf-made," Astrid said quietly, "forged in the deep halls of the mountain folk and blessed by their rune masters. There are perhaps a dozen such blades in all the northern kingdoms, and this one has never known defeat in single combat. Astrid's great-grandfather carried it when he fought alongside Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge," Bjorn added, his voice carrying genuine admiration for the weapon, even as he prepared to face it in mortal combat. "It's said to be blessed by Odin himself, that it will never fail a warrior who fights for just cause." The weight of history and expectations settled around Hakon like a cloak, but instead of being crushed by it, he found himself standing straighter. If the gods had indeed guided events to bring this blade to his hand at this moment, then perhaps the ancient prophecy carved in mountain stone was more than mere hope. "The terms," Bjorn said, formal once more, "single combat to the death, or surrender, no interference from seconds or supporters. The victor's word is law, regarding the fate of the survivors." "Accepted," Hakon replied, tucking the magical knife into his belt beside his father's axe. He would fight with both weapons, steel and iron, ancient magic and ancestral strength. The tools his fate had provided combined in service of protecting the innocent. As Bjorn's raiders formed the traditional combat circle, their torches creating a ring of flickering light in the growing darkness, Hakon found himself thinking of the path that had led him to this moment. Just days ago, he had been nothing more than a lonely hermit who carved ravens from birchwood and accepted his place on the margins of society. Now he stood in Thor's shadow, wielding weapons of power, preparing to fight for the lives of people who had never quite accepted him. The transformation felt both sudden and inevitable, as if his entire 40-year existence had been merely preparation for this single night, when everything that truly mattered would be decided by skill and courage and the favor of gods who might or might not be paying attention to the struggles of mortals far below. "Are you ready, gentle giant?" Bjorn asked, drawing his own blade, a sword that gleamed like captured sunlight and sang softly as it cut through the air. "My name," Hakon said quietly, settling into the combat stance Astrid had taught him, "is Hakon Eriksson, and yes, I'm ready." Around them the circle tightened and the night held its breath. The combat circle formed by Bjorn's raiders created an arena of flickering shadows and dancing light, their torches held high, casting wavering patterns on the ground where two men would soon fight for the fate of Fjord's survivors. At the circle's center, Hakon and Bjorn faced each other across a distance of perhaps 10 paces, each taking the measure of his opponent in the ritualized moments before violence began. Bjorn moved with the fluid confidence of a man who had faced this situation dozens of times before, his sword held in a casual grip that nonetheless spoke of perfect readiness. He wore mail that had been polished until it gleamed like fish scales, and his shield bore the wolf's head device that had become synonymous with terror throughout the northern fjords. Everything about him proclaimed the professional warrior, from his balanced stance to the way his eyes never left Hakon's center mass, reading the subtle signs that would telegraph his opponent's first move. Hakon, by contrast, looked exactly like what he was, a woodsman thrust into a situation far beyond his experience. His leather vest and simple woolen clothes marked him as common-born, and the weapons in his hands, while fine, lacked the ornate decorations that usually marked blades carried by men of noble blood. Yet there was something in his bearing that gave Bjorn pause, a stillness that spoke not of fear, but of careful preparation. "Last chance, woodsman," Bjorn called across the circle. "Yield now, accept exile, and I'll spare the woman and child. Continue this foolishness, and their deaths will be on your conscience. Their lives are why I'm here, Hakon replied, testing the weight of his father's axe while his other hand rested on the hilt of Astrid's knife. And they're why you'll have to kill me to get past this circle. Bjorn nodded, as if he had expected. No other answer. So be it. Try to die well, at least. The gods honor courage, even in fools. The attack came without further warning, Bjorn exploding into motion with the sudden violence of a striking serpent. His sword swept in a horizontal arc designed to open Hakon's throat, the blade moving so fast it seemed to blur in the torchlight. But Hakon was already moving, his axe coming up to catch the descending steel with a ringing crash that sent sparks flying into the night air. The impact drove Hakon back a step, Bjorn's superior strength and momentum combining to test his defense. Immediately. But instead of trying to match force with force, Hakon did something unexpected. He gave way, using his opponent's aggression to pull him off balance while sliding to the side in a move Astrid had drilled into him during their practice sessions. Bjorn recovered quickly, his experience showing as he turned the failed strike into a shield bash aimed at Hakon's ribs. The wooden boss caught Hakon a glancing blow, hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs, but not solid enough to break bones. More importantly, the exchange gave both fighters a chance to assess each other's capabilities. Interesting, Bjorn murmured, circling to his left while Hakon mirrored the movement. Someone has been teaching you, the woman, I assume. She always did prefer unconventional tactics. Hakon said nothing, conserving his breath for the fight while his mind raced through the lessons Astrid had taught him. Don't try to match his strength. Use his aggression against him. Stay mobile, stay defensive, wait for openings. The advice echoed in his memory as he watched Bjorn probe his defenses with quick, economical strikes that tested different angles and distances. The second exchange was longer and more complex, a flowing sequence of attack and counterattack that carried both men around the circle's perimeter. Bjorn's swordwork was poetry in motion, each strike flowing seamlessly into the next, his shield perfectly positioned to turn away Hakon's desperate counterstrokes. But Hakon was learning, adapting with each passing moment, his natural athleticism and years of precise woodcraft translating into combat skills more readily than either fighter had expected. When Bjorn's blade finally found its mark, slicing across Hakon's left forearm and drawing first blood, the raiders around the circle gave a cheer that echoed off the burning buildings of Eriksfjord. But their celebration was premature. The wound was shallow, more painful than debilitating, and the blood loss would not significantly hamper Hakon's fighting ability. First blood to me, Bjorn announced formally, as tradition demanded. Do you yield? Not yet, Hakon replied, flexing his fingers to ensure the cut hadn't severed any tendons. The pain was sharp, but manageable, and more importantly, drawing blood had taught him something about Bjorn's technique. The raider chief favored attacks that came from slightly above, striking down with the full weight of his arm and shoulder. It was then that the village bell began to toll, not the regular pealing that marked the hours, but the desperate, irregular clanging of someone pulling the rope in panic. The sound cut through the night air like a blade, and every head in the combat circle turned toward its source. From the direction of the harbor came new sounds, shouting voices, the crash of weapons, the distinctive crack of wooden hulls striking stone. Bjorn's expression shifted from confident amusement to sharp concern as he realized that something was happening beyond his control. "My lord," one of his raiders called from the circle's edge. "Ships in the harbor. They're attacking our vessels." Bjorn's eyes narrowed as he processed this information, his strategic mind immediately grasping the implications. "How many ships? Whose banners do they fly?" "Unknown, my lord. Too dark to see clearly, but there are fires on the water." For the first time since the combat had begun, uncertainty flickered across Bjorn's features. His entire plan had been predicated on maintaining control of the sea approaches. ensuring that no relief could reach Eriksfjord until his business here was concluded. If unknown forces were now attacking his fleet, everything he had worked to achieve was suddenly at risk. "The combat continues," he declared, raising his sword to forestall any argument. "Whatever happens elsewhere, this circle remains sacred until blood or surrender ends our business here." But even as he spoke, Hakon could see the calculation in his opponent's eyes changing. The leisurely, confident approach Bjorn had taken to their fight was being replaced by something more urgent, more desperate. If enemy ships were in the harbor, the raider chief could not afford to spend hours playing with an amateur swordsman, no matter how entertaining the exercise might be. When Bjorn attacked again, it was with a fury and precision that made his earlier efforts look like gentle sparring. The sword seemed to be everywhere at once, forcing Hakon into a desperate defensive crouch as he tried to keep the flashing blade away from vital areas. His axe rang like a bell as it met strike after strike, and he could feel his strength beginning to ebb under the relentless assault. It was then that he remembered Astrid's knife at his belt, its magical steel waiting to taste combat for the first time in generations. The moment Hakon's hand closed around the hilt of Astrid's knife, something extraordinary happened. The blade seemed to sing as it cleared its makeshift sheath. The dwarf forged, steel catching the torchlight and throwing it back in patterns that dazzled the eye. More than that, Hakon felt a surge of strength and clarity that had nothing to do with his own abilities, as if the weapon carried the skill and experience of every warrior who had ever wielded it. Bjorn's eyes widened as he recognized the legendary blade, his confident advance faltering for just an instant. That moment of hesitation was all Hakon needed. Moving with fluid grace that seemed to flow from the knife itself, he stepped inside Bjorn's guard and struck with both weapons simultaneously, his father's axe sweeping low while the magical blade darted high like a striking serpent. Bjorn barely managed to deflect the knife thrust with his shield's rim, but the axe found its mark, biting deep into his left thigh and sending him stumbling backward. Dark blood flowed freely from the wound, staining his polished mail and pooling in the dirt beneath his feet. "Impossible!" Bjorn snarled, pressing one hand against the wound while keeping his sword raised defensively. "No untrained fighter could—" His words cut off as understanding dawned. The blade in Hakon's hand was not merely sharp steel, but something far more dangerous, a weapon that carried the accumulated skill of generations that could make its wielder temporarily equal to warriors with decades of experience. "The gods," he whispered, genuine awe creeping into his voice, "they truly do favor you." Around the combat circle, the raiders who had been cheering their leader's dominance fell silent. Several made the sign against evil, recognizing the supernatural nature of what they were witnessing. The gentle giant who had never drawn blood before today was moving like a berserker, blessed by Odin himself. But Bjorn Ironside had not earned his fearsome reputation by yielding to impossible odds. With a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, he threw himself back into the attack with the desperate fury of a cornered wolf. His sword became a silver blur in the torchlight, each strike carrying enough force to shatter bone if it connected cleanly. The battle that followed was unlike anything the watching raiders had ever seen. Two master warriors, one blessed by ancient magic, the other driven by years of experience and desperate love, danced through a sequence of attacks and counters that pushed both men to the very limits of their abilities. Steel rang against steel with such frequency that the sound became a continuous song of war. Hakon felt the knife guiding his movements, showing him openings he would never have seen on his own, lending him the reflexes to dodge strikes that should have ended the fight instantly. But even magical assistance had its limits, and he could feel his strength beginning to fail under the relentless assault of one of the North's most feared killers. It was then that fate intervened in the form of young Sigrid's voice, calling from the temple doorway with the clarity that only terror can bring. Hakon. Behind you! One of Bjorn's raiders, either unable to bear watching his lord struggle or simply overcome by bloodlust, had broken the sacred circle and was rushing at Hakon's unprotected back with a spear leveled at his spine. The betrayal of combat law shocked even Bjorn, who shouted a command for the man to stop, but it was too late to prevent the treacherous strike. What happened next would be told in stories for generations to come. Astrid appeared as if conjured from shadow, moving with lethal grace to intercept the spear thrust meant for Hakon. Her hands closed around the weapon's shaft, and with a twist that spoke of perfect training, she wrenched it from her would-be killer's grasp and drove its point through his throat in one fluid motion. "The circle is sacred," she shouted, her voice carrying the authority of noble birth as she stood over the fallen raider. "Any man who breaks combat law forfeits his life." The remaining raiders stepped back, awed by the display of skill and the reminder of laws older than kings. But more importantly, Astrid's intervention had created the opening Hakon needed. With Bjorn momentarily distracted by his followers' treachery, the magical knife found its opportunity. The blade slipped between the rings of Bjorn's mail like water finding cracks in stone, its point coming to rest just above his heart. The raider, Ichi, froze, feeling the sharp steel pressing against his skin, knowing that one thrust would end his life. "Yield," Hakon said quietly, his voice carrying no triumph, only exhaustion and sadness for what violence had cost them all. For a long moment, Bjorn stared into his opponent's eyes, seeing not hatred or bloodlust, but something far more dangerous, genuine compassion for a fallen enemy. This was not the face of a killer drunk on victory, but of a protector who took no joy in necessary violence. From the harbor came the sound of his burning ships, the crackle of flames consuming the vessels that should have carried him and his men safely home. Whatever forces had attacked his fleet, they had done their work thoroughly. Even if he survived this combat, his retreat was cut off. Slowly, deliberately, Bjorn let his sword fall from nerveless fingers. The blade struck the ground with a sound like a funeral bell, marking the end of more than just a single combat. "I yield," he said, the words torn from him like pieces of his soul. "By the old laws and the new, by the gods who judge all warriors, I acknowledge defeat." Around the circle, his raiders lowered their weapons in stunned silence. Their invincible leader, the man who had never lost a battle, knelt in the dirt before a hermit who had learned to fight barely a week ago. But it was Bjorn's next words that would echo in Hakon's memory for the rest of his days. "The crown from my head. Take it. You have earned the right to lead these men, to command their loyalty. Use them better than I did." And with shaking hands, Bjorn removed the simple silver band that marked his authority as war chief, holding it out toward the man who had bested him in fair combat. 3 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and autumn was painting the fjords in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Hakon of the flames that had once consumed Eriksfjord. But where destruction had reigned, new growth had taken root. The village had been rebuilt stronger than before, its buildings positioned with defensive considerations that spoke of hard-won wisdom about the realities of a dangerous world. Hakon stood in the doorway of his cabin, expanded now to accommodate 2 residents instead of 1, watching Astrid tend the small garden they had planted together in the spring. The sight of her moving among the rows of vegetables and herbs still had the power to make his chest flutter with wonder at the improbable path that had led her to his door during that long-ago storm. The silver rings on their fingers caught the afternoon sunlight as she reached up to harvest late pears from the tree that had sheltered his home since before his birth. The rings had been forged from Bjorn's crown, its metal transformed from a symbol of conquest into a pledge of partnership. The village smith had crafted them with particular care, incorporating runes of protection and prosperity that Astrid had selected from the old writings her grandmother had taught her. "The messenger from King Harald should be arriving soon," Astrid said, without turning from her work, though Hakon could hear the slight tension in her voice that always accompanied discussions of their legal status. "Let him come," Hakon replied, testing the edge of his father's axe with his thumb, as he had done every morning since the night everything changed. The weapon hung once again on its peg by the door, clean and sharp, but no longer untested. "We've done nothing that requires apology." The aftermath of Bjorn's defeat had been complex, in ways that simple victory could never address. The raider. Chief's submission had transferred command of his surviving warriors to Hakon, along with the responsibility for their actions and their futures. Some had chosen to return to their homelands, bearing word of their leader's fall to families who would mourn or celebrate according to their nature. Others had remained, seeking service with the man who had bested the most feared warrior in the northern seas. Most surprising of all had been Bjorn himself. Rather than slinking away in defeat or seeking revenge through treachery, he had honored the old laws completely, accepting exile with a dignity that had won grudging respect, even from those whose loved ones he had killed. His final words before boarding the merchant vessel that would carry him to distant shores had been addressed not to Hakon, but to Astrid. "I loved you," he had said simply, "but I loved my idea of what you should be more than who you actually were. Perhaps exile will teach me the difference." The ships that had attacked Bjorn's fleet had proven to be vessels from neighboring settlements, alerted to Eriksfjord's plight by refugees who had escaped the initial assault. Their arrival had been perfectly timed to prevent the raiders' escape, though their captains had been careful to remain in international waters until the outcome of the ritual combat was decided. Vikings might be pirates and killers, but they respected the old laws above all else. Now, as Hakon watched his wife, the words still felt strange and wonderful in his thoughts, gather the fruits of their shared labor. He reflected on how completely his world had been transformed. The gentle giant who had accepted his place on the margins of society had become something he had never expected. A leader, a protector, a man whose counsel was sought by jarls and whose name was spoken with respect throughout the fjords. You ever miss the solitude?" Astrid asked, finally turning to face him with her arms full of golden pears. The quiet certainty of knowing exactly what each day would bring. Hakon considered the question with the same care he brought to any problem requiring thoughtful solution. "I miss the simplicity," he said finally, "but I wouldn't trade what we have for all the peaceful mornings in the world." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, a small party riding up the mountain path with the careful pace of men who understood they were entering the domain of someone who commanded both respect and wariness. At their head rode a young man in royal colors, his bearing marking him as one of King Harald's household warriors. "Hakon Eriksson," the messenger called as he drew rein outside the cabin. "I bear word from His Majesty regarding your irregular circumstances." "Speak your peace," Hakon replied, stepping fully outside with Astrid beside him. Whatever judgment the king had rendered, they would face it together. The messenger unrolled a parchment sealed with the royal device and read in the formal cadence required for official pronouncements. "By royal decree, the actions taken in defense of Eriksfjord are deemed lawful and justified. The exile of Astrid Eriksdottir is hereby rescinded, her honors restored, and her marriage to Hakon Eriksson recognized as valid under both civil and divine law." The relief that flooded through Hakon was so intense it nearly staggered him. They were no longer outlaws living on borrowed time, but citizens in good standing with rights and protections under royal authority. Furthermore, the messenger continued, in recognition of extraordinary service to the crown's subjects, Hakon Eriksson is appointed as King's Warden of the Northern Fjords, with authority to maintain peace and order throughout the region. This news was more startling than the pardon. To be named Royal Warden was to receive formal recognition as a leader, with the power to levy troops, collect taxes, and dispense justice in the king's name. It was a position typically reserved for men of noble birth who had spent decades proving their worth. The king has also instructed me to convey his particular interest in your unconventional methods of warfare, the messenger added, with something that might have been amusement. He wishes to know if you would be willing to train selected warriors in these techniques. After the messenger departed with Hakon's acceptance of his new appointment, husband and wife sat together on the bench outside their cabin, watching the sun set over the fjord that had become their shared kingdom. The ancient rune stones on the mountain above them caught the last light of day, their prophecies fulfilled in ways their carvers could never have imagined. The gentle becoming fierce when love is threatened, Astrid murmured, echoing the words they had read in stone so many months ago. Two souls finding each other in the storm. Do you think they knew? Hakon asked, gesturing toward the distant stones. The ones who carved those runes. Do you think they could see this far into the future? I think they understood that the greatest changes often come from the most unlikely sources, Astrid replied, her hand finding his with the natural ease of shared affection. That sometimes the world needs gentle giants more than it needs fierce warriors. As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Hakon reflected on the journey that had brought him from solitary hermit to royal warden, from the man who had never drawn blood to the protector who would be remembered in song and story. But the most remarkable transformation was the simplest, from a man who had always walked alone to one who would never be alone again. The rings on their fingers gleamed in the starlight, forged from a crown that had once symbolized the power to take whatever one desired. Now that same silver-bound two hearts that had chosen each other freely, promising a future built not on conquest, but on the quiet courage of ordinary people who discovered they were capable of extraordinary things when love gave them reason to fight. In the distance, a wolf howled from the mountains, its voice carrying across the water like an echo of older, wilder times. But here, in the circle of light, cast by their hearth, Hakon and Astrid had built something that would outlast empires, a love that had been tested by fire and found strong enough to change the fate of nations.